This is not the kind of courage that Dan Rather had in mind. It's Keith Courage on TurboWorks Episode 2.
God, I'm an attractive gal.
Sure, in the desk. The real test is how you look in the chair.
4Game Systems debuted in America in August of 1989 or thereabouts. And honestly, I'm going to come right out and say it. Of all of those systems, TurboGrafx-16 had the strongest launch lineup. And that is why it's so absolutely bewildering that NEC decided to put the worst of these games in the box for the system for America. Or maybe not bewildering? When Hudson designed the core architecture of the TurboGrafx-16, they operated on a simple principle: make it like the NES, except more awesome. In a 2003 interview available on Shmuplations, Hudson's veteran staff explained that their internal studios had really more or less honed their skills on developing games for NES, or more precisely Famicom, but they constantly found themselves butting up against the hardware's limitations. Rather than taking the sensible route that studios like Konami and Namco did and simply expand the limitations of the hardware with custom memory management chips, Hudson decided that the thing to do would just be to make their own system. And that's why the TurboGrafx-16 runs on an NES chip that's doused itself in HGH. Hudson literally designed it to be a steroidal Famicom. So let's assume that, in strategizing the loadout for the hardware at its American launch, manufacturer and distributor NEC chose to honor Hudson's approach by mirroring the early US NES era. Specifically, they looked at Bandai's output as Nintendo's first third-party PAL in America and said, yes, let's do that. To wit, Keith Courage is a sloppy, unpleasant action game based on a Japanese anime property that the US publisher was too cheap to license. Sound familiar? Don't give in to recency bias. I wouldn't compare Keith Courage and Alpha Zones to Last Battle, the Genesis game based on Fist of the North Star but published by a company too frugal to pay for the intended name. No, Keith Courage is basically the TurboGrafx-16 equivalent of Ninja Kid. I know it's been like 9 years since I covered that one, but in summary, Bandai based Ninja Kid on the manga Gegege no Kitaro, but they redrew the protagonist's sprite so that they didn't have to pay cash money for the rights to the game. Keith Courage doesn't even involve that much effort. Nothing about the American turbo chip appears to have been changed from the Japanese release, except the name and the backstory printed in the manual. Also, the box art ages up the protagonist from a 9-year-old kid to a guy who would definitely be old enough to have seen Nirvana live if he existed in the real world of 2025. But otherwise, it's the same game, code, and graphics. And, like Ninja Kid, it's not horrible, it's just kinda blech. It plays fine, I guess, but it feels uneven and sloppy. It's one of those games where you have to perform a lot of blind jumps, where you could very possibly end up landing on a bed of instant kill spikes. A game where you have to perform jumps between platforms in tight spaces, yet bumping your head against an overhead object immediately negates your upward momentum and causes you to crash instantly downward. Keith Courage has a localized story that's far too stupid for me to summarize. All you need to know is that each level of the game consists of 2 phases: the above-ground parts where you play as Keith, and the underground sequences where you take control of a set of mech armor called the Nova Suit. Keith and the Nova Suit play more or less alike, except that you can move a lot faster in Nova mode, and the Nova sequences are less linear, and all the weapons you buy as Keith actually go toward the Nova armor. This disparity becomes agonizingly clear once you complete the first Nova phase and revert back to Keith, who runs around in strictly linear spaces and feels horrible to play as. Runs around is actually a misleading term. It's more that you slowly grind along at a glacial pace because you are a small, weak child instead of a cool robot suit. Which makes sense, but that doesn't make it fun. Sometimes video games need to diverge from reality in order to be entertaining, and this is one of those cases. Anyway, Keith Courage was called Mashin Eiyuden Wataru in Japan, a tie-in with a short-lived anime series that, according to Wikipedia, was the most popular and successful Japanese anime in China for a while in its localized form. It never came to the US though, so we missed out on what, from what I've seen, was a compilation of all the worst and most annoying habits of 80s anime. Produced by Sunrise, Mashin Eiyuden Wataru's driving philosophy can be summed up as, let's make a Gundam-esque show for stupid children that we hate. Protagonist Wataru gets pulled into a multi-level fantasy world, where he ascends tiers of existence by beating bosses and returning chromatic values to that land's bleak, monochromatic rainbow. Along the way, he befriends a truly repugnant collection of generic friends and allies, many of whom appear to be traced sloppily from Akira Toriyama's Dr. Slump series. Some of these characters sadly show up in Keith Courage, such as the Arale-looking Nurse Nancy, who will refill your health for a steep fee. None of this actually matters to Keith Courage the video game, which is just a laborious, failed attempt to do something interesting with the run-and-jump platformer. It's the kind of game where you can't actually avoid taking damage. There are areas where you literally have to hop across damaging lava fields. And the entire thing is built around similarly bewildering bad design choices. The brief phases where you play as Keith are actually meant to be soaked in. Instead of just running left or right until you reach the Novasuit Rainbow, Keith Courage and Alpha Zone really want you to linger and run back and forth, killing enemies and collecting the coins they occasionally drop. You can use this money for essential health refills, thanks Nancy, but also to invest in better weapons for the Novasuit, or secondary attack options. You only earn money in Keith mode, but you can only use the upgrades you buy in Nova mode. I feel like this game kind of hates Keith, but honestly, having seen a few episodes of the Wataru anime, can't blame it. Even if I hadn't witnessed the misery that is the Wataru anime firsthand, I'd kind of be rooting for the bad guys anyway. Despite the cover art and the determinedly American comic being packed in with the game, Keith Courage radiates manic Japanese cartoon sensibilities. The Novasuit is basically a really stocky Gundam wearing, like, a Magatama necklace. The bad guys consist of oddballs, like the little fire plug dudes who run around with a giant revolver mounted on their skulls, and more mundane imagery like Maneki Neko. Well, I say mundane, but you didn't actually see a lot of this sort of bog-standard Japanese iconography in the US back in 1989. What I'm saying is that Keith Courage is all over the place, an effect reinforced by the extremely surface-level localization, all of which makes it even weirder as the pack-in title for the console. As I recently touched on with Altered Beast, pack-ins need to walk a tricky line to be effective. They should show off the capabilities of the hardware and whet players' interest, but at the same time, they can't be too substantial or else risk undermining uptake of additional software. Altered Beast, I think, walked the line pretty well. It looked cool and it featured two-player action, but it was also kind of dumb and shallow, so after a short bit of entertainment and visual splendor, it left Genesis owners longing for more. Nintendo's Super Mario World for Super NES strayed too far into the pro-consumer direction, showcasing the hardware to good effect but also providing a lot of game. Why buy another cartridge when you had 96 stages of Super Mario World to enjoy? Keith Courage strays too far in the other direction. It looked pretty decent for a 1989 game, though it paled in comparison to Genesis's launch lineup. However, it had approximately zero staying power. Thanks to its low difficulty level, anemic length, and infinite continues, this was a game that new TurboGrafx 16 owners could complete in an afternoon. Certainly it left them wanting more, but in a disappointed, mercenary kind of way. Its inclusion feels like a corporate decision through and through. A free game that feels worth every penny of nothing. It's the worst game in the TurboGrafx launch lineup by far, which certainly made kids seek out something better, but it didn't really seem like the best foot to start out on, you know? Well, that was a letdown, but don't worry, the Turbo launch lineup had at least as many great games as it did mediocre ones. So here's what I'm going to do with the next few videos. Each episode will pair one of the good ones with one of the mediocre ones. And so here to balance out Keith Courage, we have Victory Run. Let's not mince words here. Victory Run is just a shameless attempt by Hudson to ride the glorious coattails of Sega's Outrun. And I mean, who can blame them? You're going to make a racing game that shows off the capabilities of your hardware at the end of 1987, when Victory Run first shipped in Japan. Why not aim for the most glorious and exciting new racing game around? Besides the fact that only mutants and weirdos hate Outrun, working in that vein allows you to establish a simple visual reference point for the capabilities of your new hardware. For anyone wondering how the TurboGrafx 16 would stack up to competing systems in terms of horsepower and graphical effects, they need look no further than this baseline racing experience. In this case, based on the performance of Victory Run, we can safely say that the console has nowhere near the power of the actual Outrun arcade board. I don't think anyone really expected that from a glorified NES, at least not anyone with even a modicum of common sense. However, compare Victory Run to Rad Racer, whose Famicom release Highway Star arrived at retail a mere 3 months ahead of Victory Run, and NEC's machine absolutely pastes Nintendo's hardware. Even with programming by the mad genius Nasir Gabelli and support for the Famicom's active shutter 3D glasses, Rad Racer just didn't stack up to the speed, visual detail, or design sophistication of this, a launch title created by programmers who were still figuring out the quirks of this brand new hardware. Or, hey, there's also the apples to apples approach, given that the TurboGrafx 16 was conceptually the Mark III to Famicom's SG-1000. The Mark III port of Outrun shipped in Japan in June of 1987, about 6 weeks ahead of Highway Star, and setting the standard for console racing games at the time. Impressive as Sega's conversion work with Outrun ended up being, it didn't come close to feeling as smooth as Victory Run, despite incorporating much smaller, less visually spectacular on-screen objects. Victory Run is a bootleg adaptation of Sega's racing hit that humbles the actual home version of that game. In 1987, this absolutely, undeniably set the standard for home renditions of racing on a graphical level. It looks great and animates fluidly. The road twists and turns and undulates, and while the roadside objects tend to be fairly sparse and have a sort of choppy step-based scaling presentation echoed by the competing racers, it's a fast and lovely take on racing. And on top of that, it has its own distinct worldview, literally. Victory Run goes one up over Outrun's pleasant romp through European scenery by giving its race a greater sense of structure, presenting it as an ersatz Paris-Dakar rally. I don't believe the game actually cites it as such, but the race map that appears at checkpoints along the way makes the intent pretty clear to anyone who followed rally racing at even a casual level. The Paris-Dakar rally arguably peaked in popularity in 1988, so Hudson was riding a couple of different trends here. We begin the race in France, the Eiffel Tower drifting perpetually in the background, and then eventually pass through desert and mountain terrain. Granted, it doesn't make sense to have the Eiffel Tower permanently visible ahead of you during segment 1 since you're meant to be driving away from Paris, but getting hung up on that kind of pedantry is why no one likes to hang out with you. Lighten up, have fun for once, honestly. Victory Run takes place over the span of 6 segments, each one effectively leading to one of the major waypoints along the real-life Paris-Dakar rally route, and finally leading you to your destination, the capital of former French colony Senegal, located along the western coast of Africa, just south of the Sahara's desertification line. Now, there is one big difference between Victory Run and the actual Paris-Dakar rally, or just the Dakar rally now, since the race no longer begins in Europe. The real race takes about 2 weeks to complete. Victory Run takes about 15 minutes. Each stretch of the race gives you a target time for completion, ranging from a minute to about 2.5 minutes in total. Not quite the same grueling, sometimes fatal experience as the legitimate rally. Still, Victory Run does its best to emulate the difficulty of its inspiration with an interesting customization element. At the outset of the race, you're allowed to spend 20 points on various car attributes, including tires, suspension, gearbox, and brakes. Most racing games of the era generally gave you a few of those points to invest at the outset, and then let you earn more credits based on performance, so that you could spend them between heats. The idea being to make your car progressively more powerful, responsive, and competitive with each new phase. Not here. The 20 attribute points you receive at the beginning are all the attribute points that you ever receive. This is a race of endurance and attrition, and you need to spend your points wisely in order to have a shot at finishing out all 6 phases of the competition. As your car performs, or endures different hardships on the road, it experiences wear on a corresponding attribute. Brake in traffic, and your brakes degrade. Hit a rise too hard, and your suspension suffers strain. Shift gears at the wrong time, and you grind your gearbox. You can't replace or repair damaged components along the way, so you really have to be mindful of how you invest your skill points at the start and take care to race with caution and precision, while at the same time doing your damnedest to go as fast as possible, because those time limits are brutal. This makes Victory Run a crazy hard game. I am not particularly adept in the racing genre, but Victory Run gave me the most trouble that I've had with any racer since repeatedly failing my Gran Turismo driving test and being locked out of the actual game. But this friction gives it a flavor all its own. Victory Run must have been quite a sight at the time of its PC Engine debut, arriving in a dead heat of similar Outrun clones, and actual Outruns, on the other major consoles. With superior graphics and sophisticated design, Victory Run would have been a powerful statement by Hudson to convince consumers to buy into their new platform. And it still impressed 2 years later when it finally reached the US, just not quite as much as it would have in '87. After all, Rad Racer and Master System Outrun had already long since come and gone here. Outrun itself was 3 years old in arcades. It wasn't the new hotness. It had been supplanted by more technically impressive racers like Power Drift and Hard Drivin'. And the baseline of graphical standards had experienced a massive level up too, thanks to the Genesis launch a few weeks earlier. Victory Run in Japan demonstrated PC Engine's cutting-edge nature. But in the US, it's a synecdoche of the disadvantages that resulted from the late arrival of the TurboGrafx 16. That being said, it is still a heck of a racer. Maybe not a bleeding-edge home release at this point, but still more impressive than any console racer to have hit an American console. A bit stale, yes, but excellent all the same. Next time on TurboWorks, not the preferred nomenclature, dude.